The calm of a Saturday morning was a hard-earned luxury for Darnell. After 2 tours overseas, the simple pleasures, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the soften of the refrigerator, the distant laughter of his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, from the living room, felt like a reward. This new house in the quiet, tree-lined suburb was supposed to be their sanctuary, the final piece of a peaceful life he'd promised his wife, Maya. He was savoring that first, bitter sip of coffee when the sound erupted. It wasn't a friendly tap or a polite doorbell ring. It was a sudden, percussive bm that shook the front door in its frame. It was a kind of knock that spoke of impatience and authority, a sound that instantly vaporized the morning's tranquility. Darnell's body responded before his mind could, his posture straightening, his senses sharpening. The relaxed slouch of a civilian was gone, replaced by the alert readiness of a soldier. He set his mug down on the counter with a quiet, deliberate click. Maya appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide with a silent question. He gave a slight, reassuring nod and moved toward the door. Through the peephole, he saw 2 men. They weren't police. Their posture was all wrong, a slouched attempt at authority. They wore cheap, nylon tactical vests, the kind bought online, with poorly stitched HOA security patches velcroed onto the front. The one doing the knocking was broad-shouldered, with a flushed face. The other, thinner and weaselly, scanned the street with nervous eyes. Darnell turned the deadbolt and opened the door just enough to assess the situation. The morning sunlight hit the faux military webbing of their vests, highlighting their inadequacy. The larger man didn't waste a breath. "You, Darnell," he barked, his voice unnecessarily loud. "We've had reports you own firearms. That's not allowed in this community." He puffed out his chest, trying to fill the cheap vest. "We're here to confiscate them immediately." For a full 3 seconds, Darnell froze. It wasn't fear that locked his joints. It was sheer, disbelieving cognitive dissonance. His mind, trained to assess threats and analyze rules of engagement, raced through the logic. Confiscate? HOA security? The homeowners association packet he'd skimmed was filled with bylaws about trash can storage and fence paint colors. There was nothing, absolutely nothing about firearms. His guns were legally purchased, meticulously registered, and secured in a heavy-duty safe bolted to the garage floor. The sheer audacity of the demand was staggering. Something was deeply off. Their eyes darted around, never holding his gaze for long. The vests were empty of any real equipment. No radios, no proper badges, just those laughable patches. Most tellingly, their authority was a flimsy facade, a performance meant to intimidate a normal homeowner, not a man who had faced down actual insurgents. A cold calm settled over Darnell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing, pinning the lead man with an intensity that made the would-be enforcer's bluster falter. "Is that right?" Darnell's voice was low, even and dangerously calm. "First, you're going to show me a city ordinance or a specific bylaw, printed and signed. That gives you that authority. Not a verbal report. A document." The man blinked, thrown by the tactical, legalistic response. "We don't need to show you," he began, but Darnell cut him off. "Second," Darnell continued, his voice dropping another decibel, "you're going to tell me who exactly filed this report. Because making a false report to harass a veteran and his family is a serious felony." The mention of veteran and felony had an immediate effect. The weaselly man in the back took a half step away from the door. The lead man's confidence cracked, his bravado replaced by a flicker of panic. They had expected a quick, frightened compliance. They were not prepared for a man who understood both the law and the art of confrontation. Darnell didn't wait for their reply. His hand tightened on the door. "Until you can produce that documentation and a sworn affidavit from your source, this conversation is over. If you step onto my property again, I will not be speaking to you. I'll be speaking to the police." He didn't slam the door. He closed it with a firm, final thud that echoed the knock that had started all, re-engaging the deadbolt with a definitive click. The sanctuary had been breached, but it was still as to defend. The calm Saturday morning was gone, replaced by a different kind of mission. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association wasn't just active. It was a sovereign state of suburban control, with bylaws instead of constitution, and a particular breed of zealot for its citizenry. Their purview extended far beyond the standard mandates of lawn height and fence maintenance. They governed the shade of your mulch, redwood or hemlock bark, no dyed black chips, the precise angle of your window blinds, 45 degrees upward for uniformity, and the legality of the basketball hoop left at the curb for more than an hour after dusk. For most residents, it was a low-grade nuisance, the price paid for pristine curbs and property values. But for Darnell, the HOA's interest quickly morphed from petty to pernicious. The incident at his door was not an isolated overstep. It was the opening salvo in a whisper campaign. The story of the two faux security men being turned away spread, but not accurately. It wasn't told as a tale of veterans standing his ground against intimidation. Instead, it was warped in the echo chamber of neighborhood group chats and overpruned hedges. The narrative, carefully cultivated, was that the new neighbor on Sycamore Drive was dangerous. The rumors took on a life of their own, fed by an undercurrent of suburban fear. "I heard he has an entire arsenal," one neighbor would murmur at the community mailbox. "Does that seem safe with a little girl next door?" Another would reply, their concern laced with judgment. The most insidious whispers came from those who cloaked their bias in a veil of community spirit. "Guns just don't belong in a place like this. This is a family community." The implication was clear. A man who owned firearms was, by default, not a family man. Let's be unequivocally clear. Darnell's firearms were a non-issue by any legal or rational measure. Each one was 100% legally owned, with paperwork as meticulous as his military service record. They resided not under a bed or in a closet, but locked inside a state-of-the-art, 500-pound safe bolted to the concrete slab of a garage. Ammunition was stored separately, keys hidden. For Darnell, a man who had seen the consequences of negligence, responsible ownership was a creed, not a suggestion. He was a protector, not a provocateur. The engine of this crusade was Karen. She wasn't just a member of the HOA board. She was its self-appointed queen, its moral arbiter. Her authority was derived not from official title alone, but from an unshakable belief in her own righteousness and a boundless capacity for nosiness. For Karen, the HOA wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about enforcing conformity. And Darnell, a strong-willed, independent-minded veteran, represented a threat to her control. His refusal to be intimidated by her HOA cops, a pair of her nephew's equally dim-witted gym buddies she'd enlisted for the job, was a personal insult. Knowing she had no legal leg to stand on, the association's covenants were silent on the matter of lawful firearm ownership. She opted for a different strategy: siege by social pressure. Instead of official channels, she cooked up a plan of harassment disguised as community concern. She began filing daily violation reports against Darnell for infractions that were either fabricated or absurdly exaggerated. A single, faded newspaper left on the driveway for 10 minutes became blight and accumulation of trash. Chloe's bicycle lying on the lawn while she ran inside for a drink was an unsecured hazard and eyesore. Each notice was a paper cut, designed to bleed him of his peace and sanity. Karen's goal was to make life in Willow Creek Estate so intolerably hostile that Darnell would either capitulate and surrender his rights or be forced to move. She was playing a long game, betting that the quiet veteran would eventually break under the weight of constant, petty persecution. But Karen had fundamentally misjudged her opponent. Darnell hadn't just fought enemies on foreign soil. He'd endured the psychological grind of deployment. A woman with a clipboard and a vicious streak was, in many ways, a familiar foe. The battle for his home had just begun, and he was digging in for a war of attrition. The two men standing at Darnell's door assembled their authority like a child playing dress-up, layering on cheap props to create an illusion of power. They puffed out their chests against nylon tactical vests that still had the creases from their shipping bags. On their hips, utility belts jangled with an assortment of unnecessary tools, a bulky flashlight, a multi-tool still in its plastic packaging, and handcuffs that had the dull, pewter-like sheen of novelty items. One of them held a walkie-talkie that crackled with static, a sound effect meant to imply a connection to a larger operation. When the larger man flashed his ID, it was a laminated card, but the lamination was bubbled and uneven, and the font was a standard Microsoft Word typeface, the kind you'd use for a garage sale sign. But Darnell was no ordinary homeowner. His eyes, trained in environments where misidentifying a threat could be fatal, conducted a rapid tactical assessment. He didn't see enforcers. He saw a checklist of inconsistencies. The vests were empty of the wear and tear of actual use. The badges, pinned crookedly, were thin, flimsy metal, the kind found in a Halloween costume kit. Their boots were scuffed, but from weekend wear, not daily patrols. Most tellingly, their body language was all bluster and no substance, a performance for an audience they expected to be easily cowed. A profound calm settled over Darnell. This was a familiar space, the quiet before a different kind of engagement. He wasn't being confronted by a legitimate threat. He was being tested by amateurs. His voice, when he spoke, was low and even, devoid of the anger they were trying to provoke. "Who exactly authorized you to be here?" he asked, his gaze locking onto the lead man's eyes. The man flinched, thrown by the specific, procedural question. He'd expected fear, compliance, or indignant shouting. He hadn't expected a debrief. "The HOA has decided firearms aren't permitted," he repeated, a robotic return to his script. "You need to hand them over now or we'll escalate this." The word escalate was meant to sound ominous, but it rang hollow. That's when Darnell's training fully kicked in. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a hostile negotiation. Instead of arguing the point, the HOA can't do that, he shifted to what he mentally termed military protocol. His goal was not to win a shouting match, but to systematically dismantle their operational legitimacy, exposing every flaw in their chain of command and rules of engagement. "Understood," Darnell said, his tone neutral, almost conversational. "Step 1, verification of authority. I need to see the specific bylaw, with the article and clause number, that grants the HOA the power of confiscation. I will need a physical copy, signed and dated by the board president." The two men exchanged a glance. They had no such document. Karen had given them verbal instructions, a mission based on sheer audacity. "We don't carry that on us," the smaller man stammered. "Then your orders are incomplete," Darnell stated flatly. "Step 2, identification verification. Your badges list no issuing agency, no badge numbers, and no expiration dates. They are invalid. I need to see government-issued peace officer credentials. Do you have them?" A bead of sweat traced a path down the lead man's temple. "We're HOA security. This is our credential." "Negative. That is a costume piece. Without valid credentials, you're a private citizen trespassing on my property and attempting to illegally seize my private property." He paused, letting the legal way of the word sink in. "Step 3, chain of command. I need the full name of the individual who gave you this order. I will be filing a police report for attempted burglary and impersonation of law enforcement, and they will be named as a co-conspirator." The color drained from their faces. They had been prepared for a fight, but not for this kind of cold, logical dismantling. Darnell wasn't emotional. He was procedural. He was treating their intimidation tactic like a broken piece of equipment, identifying each point of failure. "This is your only warning," Darnell said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was far more threatening than any shout. "You will leave my property immediately. You will inform whoever sent you that their operation has been compromised and is a catastrophic failure. The next interaction will be with the county sheriff." He didn't wait for a reply. He took a single, deliberate step forward, not an aggression, but as a reclamation of space. The two men, their facade of authority utterly shattered, instinctively stumbled backward off the porch. Without another word, Darnell closed the door, the solid thud of the deadbolt echoing like a verdict. The power play was over, and the amateurs had just learned a hard lesson about confronting professional. The aggressive knock still echoed in the air, but inside Darnell's home, a profound silence had fallen, broken only by the soft, decisive click of the front door's deadbolt sliding into place. He wasn't just closing a door. He was sealing a perimeter. These clowns, as he correctly assessed them, weren't getting an inch. His movements were fluid, practiced. Without taking his eyes off the blurred shapes beyond the frosted glass of the door, he reached for a small keypad on the wall. A series of silent, deliberate presses and a soft green light glowed. His home's integrated security system, a vestige of his desire to protect his family in a world he knew could be unpredictable, was now fully active. High-definition cameras mounted under the eaves and a microphone embedded in the doorframe began capturing every word, every shift in posture, every telltale hesitation. This was no longer a confrontation. It was evidence collection. Returning to the door, he opened it just wide enough to re-engage, his body a barrier in the frame. His voice was flat, devoid of the fear or anger they expected. It was the tone of a man filling out a form. "Before we proceed, I need your full legal names," he stated, not asked, "and your official badge numbers. Now." The two men blinked. The script was falling apart. The larger one, the one who had done the talking, fumbled. That's not necessary. We're here on HOA business." "It is necessary for my records," Darnell countered, his gaze unwavering. "And while you're at it, I need the specific statute or bylaw number that grants a homeowners association the authority to confiscate private property, specifically firearms, which are protected under state and federal law." The hesitation was palpable. The smaller man looked at his partner, his eyes wide with a silent panic. The stammered response, "It's in the rules," was a confession in itself. That moment of uncertainty told Darnell everything he needed to know. These weren't real officers. They were bullies with a flimsy cover story. The assessment was complete. Now came the countermaneuver. Darnell moved into what he called contain and control. He didn't retreat inside. Instead, he stepped fully onto his porch, closing the distance in a way that asserted his dominance over his own property. In his hand, held casually at his side, but angled perfectly, his smartphone's camera was recording. He raised his voice, not in a shout, but in a clear, projecting announcement meant for any curious neighbors who might be listening. "Attention! These two individuals are impersonating law enforcement officers. They have no legal authority. I have contacted the county sheriff's department. Anyone who aids or abets them in this illegal action will be held legally responsible." The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from the men's faces, leaving a pale, waxy fear. The performance was over. The reality of their situation, potential felonies, crashed down on them. The thin veneer of authority evaporated, replaced by the raw panic of cornered amateurs. The larger man started to protest, but the words died in his throat. Right on cue, Darnell raised the phone to his ear, his thumb having already dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was a calm, electronic counterpoint to the tension on the porch. 911, what is your emergency? "Yes, I'm reporting two men at my residence impersonating police officers," Darnell said, his voice remarkably calm and clear. He provided his address. "They're wearing tactical vests with fake badges labeled HOA security and are attempting an illegal seizure of firearms. They are currently on my property. I am armed and within my rights, but I am seeking immediate law enforcement intervention." He stayed on the line, a live witness to the scene. The two men looked like they wanted to bolt, but seemed frozen, caught in the spotlight of their own failed scheme. Within minutes, the distant wail of a siren cut through the suburban calm, growing rapidly louder. Soon, the street was illuminated with the rotating red and blue beams of real authority. Two county sheriff's cruisers pulled up, and deputies emerged, their posture, their gear, their practiced ease radiating an authenticity the imposters could only mimic. The deputies quickly separated the two men, their questions sharp and professional. Darnell provided a concise statement and, crucially, offered the high-definition footage from his security system. The HOA cops shrunk under the gaze of actual law enforcement, their story crumbling with every stammered reply. The flashing lights weren't just a signal of arrival. They were the final, glaring exposure of pathetic power play that had backfired spectacularly. The real authorities were now in charge, and Darnell's calm, documented defense had just become their primary evidence. The flashing lights of the sheriff's cruisers didn't just illuminate the two shaken imposters on Darnell's lawn. They lit up the entire neighborhood's understanding of the situation. The subsequent investigation peeled back the layers of the scheme with satisfying clarity. The HOA cops were, as suspected, nothing more than hired goons. One was Karen's nephew, a man with a history of petty offenses and a tendency toward bullying. The other was a friend from her nephew's gym, enticed by the promise of easy money and a cheap thrill. They were not licensed security guards, had never received any formal training, and their entire operation was a theatrical production designed to prey on fear. The charges were swift and serious: criminal impersonation of law enforcement and attempted burglary. The cheap vests and homemade badges were now tagged as evidence in a felony case. The sheriff's office made a public statement that resonated through Willow Creek Estates like a gavel strike. They clarified, in unambiguous terms, the Homeowners Association possesses zero legal authority over the lawful possession of firearms within a private residence. An HOA governs flower beds, not fundamental rights, a lieutenant stated dryly at a press briefing. Darnell's rights, and by extension the rights of every other resident, were firmly protected under state and federal law. The attempt to seize his property was not just an overreach, it was a criminal act. As the story spread, the neighborhood underwent a quiet but profound reckoning. The whispers that had once painted Darnell as dangerous were now replaced by murmurs of shock and embarrassment. Residents who had passively supported Karen's crusade, or would remain silent out of desire to avoid conflict, now felt a sting of collective shame. They saw the viral video of Darnell's calm, procedural dismantling of the threat, and it cast the entire affair in a new light. The man they had feared was, in fact, the one who had upheld the rule of law against a petty tyrant. The HOA board, terrified of legal liability and public outrage, moved quickly to distance themselves. Emergency meetings were held and statements were issued condemning Karen's unauthorized and illegal actions. She was forced to resign in disgrace, her reign of micromanagement ending not with a whimper, but with the screech of police sirens. In the vacuum left by Karen's departure, a subtle shift occurred. Darnell, who had been viewed with suspicion, became something of an unlikely community legend. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now waved warmly. They began to approach him, not with complaints, but with questions. A young couple asked him about home security systems. An elderly man, worried about rising burglary rates in a nearby town, sought his advice on personal safety. It wasn't just about guns. It was about a broader principle. Darnell had demonstrated a quiet, unassailable strength that resonated deeply. He had become a symbol of how to stand firm against overreach, whether from a hostile HOA board or any other form of unjust authority. Weeks later, when a local journalist came to do a follow-up story on the incident, Darnell stood on his porch, the scene of the confrontation now just a peaceful patch of concrete. He reflected on the ordeal without a trace of gloating. His summation was as measured and powerful as his actions had been. "They thought it was about intimidation," he told the reporter, his gaze steady. "They thought being loud and aggressive was the same as having power. But freedom isn't about that. Freedom is about knowing your rights so deeply that no one can shout you out of them. It's about staying calm when others are losing their heads, because clarity is your greatest weapon. And ultimately, it's about standing firm, not with anger, but with resolve on the ground the law has given you when someone tries to take them away." His words circulated through the community,